Our next speaker is Mr. Curtis Hanson. He is a senior threat intelligence analyst at Pricewaterhouse, and he works alongside incident response teams. He specializes in the Middle East and espionage actors. He is definitely on the cyber threat intel side of things, but he does work with social media and tracking people in ways that pretty much everybody here probably does. So I think you will probably get a lot from his presentation. Curtis, are you here?
Yes.
All right. You ready to go?
Yep, ready.
Okay, here we go.
Thanks for the introduction. Thanks everyone for sticking around and joining. I'm going to be talking about leveraging OSINT to track cyber threat actors. And the OSINT I discussed today actually isn't very technical, which might come as a little bit of a shock and surprise because you see that word cyber in the title. But we'll get to that. Just to get some things out of the way in terms of jargon, sort of industry terms, I'm going to use the term cyber threat actor. You guys might be more familiar with the term hacker. They're very interchangeable, sort of synonymous, so just associate threat actor with hacker for this. So who am I? Well, my name is Curtis Hanson. I currently work at PwC as a cyber threat intelligence analyst. Prior to this, I did a lot of enhanced due diligence investigations, stuff you might consider more classical OSINT type stuff. My area of expertise has always sort of lied within the Middle East. And so because of that, now as a threat intel analyst, I focus a lot on Iran-based threat actors. And today I have 3 case studies for you, all using sort of Iran-based threat actors as examples. However, with that being said, the applications, the techniques, everything I present to you today are very much universally applicable. Doesn't matter where your investigation takes you, these will apply. So what exactly are we going to discuss today? Well, the first thing I have for you is actually looking at, say, Twitter trends and how to use those to attempt attribution and timeline events. And then we'll jump over to the second case study, which is finding information that the FBI hasn't publicly released, even though they probably should actually. And we're going to round things out with validating an anonymous source before it sort of hits the mainstream, creating that sort of intelligence product before anyone else has sort of their sights on it. So without further ado, the first case study I have for you, I've titled this "An Obstacle is an Inspiration." I think you'll understand what I mean by this in the coming slides. So this starts with this burning question, who is lab detecting? And to give you a little background for those who have never heard this term or know what this is, in 26 March 2019, an entity by the name Lab Detectin appeared out of nowhere. This entity was unknown, very mysterious at the time, but made huge headlines in the cybersecurity world. And they made these headlines because they basically were leaking a bunch of highly sensitive information, dropping some sort of bombshell allegations, all related and pertaining to this Iran-based threat actor called Oil Rig. Now, for us in the cyber threat intelligence world, we had known about Oil Rig, we've been tracking them for many years. But Lab Detectin, like I said, comes out of nowhere and basically says, hey, this threat actor is part of Iran's Ministry of Intelligence, and I can prove it, and starts just dropping these technical sort of details and tools as proof, you know, the victims they had as proof, and even the personnel, the operators doing the hacking. So this is quite sort of scandalous and huge allegations being had here. So this is why I made these headlines, but you know, it made me want to answer the question, well, who the heck is Lab Detectin? Like, they shouldn't have this information. How did they get it? So I start poring over their Telegram channel where they're leaking this information. And I quickly sort of come to the assessment that this is almost certainly an information operation. It has sort of all the hallmarks, the classic bearings of deny, disrupt, degrade, in this case, the Iranian government. So, you know, I have a little bit of understanding what Lab Detectin's sort of intentions are here, but I still don't know who they are. And so I set out to attribute Lab Detectin, and unfortunately, I don't get very far. Lab Detectin had really good operational security practice. Their OPSEC was pretty top notch. And so they didn't make any sort of little mistake I could capitalize on. I couldn't take a mistake and pinpoint it to, say, a person, a company, a country, a region, anything like that. And so this was the obstacle I was facing. I was facing, answering my question here, who lab detecting is, I couldn't. So I use this as inspiration to basically go back through the data, go back through the Telegram channel, everything they had leaked, and actually look at, say, information on the periphery, stuff we often overlook or take for granted. And in this case, it was social media profiles and Twitter trends. Now, I mentioned Lab Detectin basically exposed the personnel or operators behind oil rig. And in exposing them, they released their social media profiles. A lot of them had Twitter profiles. And so I'm looking through these Twitter profiles, and I immediately see that the Twitter profiles have trends. In the bottom right-hand corner, I've highlighted them in red. And these trends, they catch my eye because a lot of the hashtags are very different, but there's a common theme I keep seeing, and that's location. Oslo, Norway keeps popping up. And I have two examples here, but there are other Twitter accounts that I could see this sort of same pattern, Oslo, but different other hashtags. So I immediately wanted to, go find out, well, what are these Twitter trends being based on? What's generating these? And before I did that, I wanted to validate that these accounts existed, that these images being posted by Lab Detectin were real, right? They weren't tampered with. So I basically set out to do that, and it proved a little difficult because these guys were basically alleged to be spies. And the first thing they did was go delete their accounts or go scrub the data on there. And rightfully so, right? Even if the allegations were true or not, it makes sense, the human instinct to go do that. So I had to do what I call post-mortem social media analysis, to the best of my abilities, verify that these accounts either existed at some time, via some cached images or things like that. Go through these images that Lab Detectin have posted. They don't seem to be spoofed or tampered with. So this was sort of my baseline that I had made assessment that these accounts are real, and this is sort of the images I have to go on. And then I go over to Twitter and say, hey, what is generating these trends then? Now knowing these accounts are likely real. Well, Twitter says, everything a normal account is basically doing, where you're located, who you're liking, what you're retweeting, who's following you, who you're following, right? Basic stuff of Twitter accounts. And I immediately jump at location. Location and attribution are pretty synonymous. I think this would be great. And I quickly dismiss this, right? I immediately assess, highly unlikely Lab Detectin is based in Oslo or based in Norway. And this is because of that notion that they had really good OPSEC. Their operational security was good, so there's no sort of rhyme or reason why they shouldn't be using a VPN or a proxy. And if they used a VPN or a proxy, that location would be spoofed. So if they're coming from Russia, their VPN, it says Oslo, in fact, they're in Russia. So that was a bit of a bummer, right? It still couldn't actually attribute. But looking at these Twitter trends, I thought there's still some information here that I could get some more analysis out of. And so I started thinking, maybe I can timeline the actions of Lab Detectin. This clearly wasn't something that happened overnight. This was something a bit more premeditated, just from the feel and how they acted. So what I did was, looking at these hashtags, I thought hashtags are basically events. Events take place in time. Let me see if I can create a timeline of when Lab Detectin started collecting this data. And so these hashtags in the right-hand corner, hashtag MUFC, that's Manchester United Football Club, hashtag Liverpool, that's also a football club, soccer teams if you're from the US. These guys didn't play a match in late March 2019 when Lab Detectin appeared. They played a match when these were trending, these hashtags, in mid to late February. So almost 3 to 4 weeks before Lab Detectin appeared. Now, this was quite interesting to me because now I could assess that Lab Detectin likely started collecting information for their operation, 3 to 4 weeks out. This was very much strategized, premeditated, not something that just unfolded sort of overnight. One last notion is, I wanted to just figure out what are these sort of trends, what do they sort of correspond to, maybe get a little more insights into Lab Detectin's intentions and motivations. So I just Googled all of them. And one stood out to me, this hashtag DJRG19 in the image on the left. This is clearly some sort of acronym. The 19 corresponded to that year, 2019. And so I just popped that into a search engine, in this case, Google, and I found something quite interesting. what I found was it stood for Digital Journalism Research Group. And this group put on a symposium in Oslo, but the symposium was on countering online disinformation. So quite interesting here, right? Because I had made the assessment initially that LabDetectin is conducting an information operation. And now, sort of unbiased, without any of my opinion, Twitter's algorithm comes to the same conclusion. That's pretty cool as an Intel analyst to see someone come up with that without any sort of biasness overtaking you, right? They assess that LabDetectin's account is also looking at, say, countering online disinfo, looking at information operation type activity. So the techniques I used here, I mean, they're pretty trivial in the sense I was just looking at an image. I was looking at the data in the image. But, you know, a bit novel in the sense I looked at the stuff we often overlook or take for granted and looked in the background of the image. And in this case, there was Twitter trends there and the hashtags. And they allowed me to actually go out and timeline events in this case. Attempt attribution, unfortunately, they used a VPN most likely. So, you know, if in another case it didn't use a VPN or proxy, you could actually maybe attribute to a location. And finally, was also able to sort of assess their motivations and intentions a little bit better, right? We saw that with assessing it's an info op. And then at the end there, they're very much into looking at how to counter sort of disinformation. So that brings us to case study 2. And I've titled this Leave No Stone Unturned. And this is actually one of the, I think, neater reports I've done. Still today, I think it holds up. And it starts with FBI Most Wanted poster of Mr. Bahazad Mesri here. Now, Mr. Mesri has been indicted 2 times by the US government. The first time for stealing Game of Thrones and attempting to extort them attempting to extort HBO for 6 million Bitcoin. The second go around, he basically hacks US intelligence personnel. He's conducting espionage. And throughout these sort of indictments of his, he's alleged to work at the behest of the IRGC, which is a body that's very much entrenched in Iran's security and intelligence apparatus. Now, his FBI Most Wanted poster has all the typical stuff you'd expect: known aliases, DOB, nationality, right? I preface with Mr. Mesri here because in the cyber threat intelligence world, we typically see the attack unfold on the technical side. So we see the zeros and ones, right? We see the IP addresses, we see the tools they use to access data, how they exfiltrated that data, stuff like that. And we know there's a human person behind the computer doing this, but we don't often know who that person is. We don't have an image of them, we don't have a name. In this case, I had that. So what I set out to do was basically map Mr. Mesri to known cyber activity we track in the cyber threat intelligence world. And in doing that, I basically start with his 2019 indictment. And starting with his 2019 indictment, I'm reading along and I see Mr. Mesri registered an Iranian company in December 2014, but the name of it is only known to the US government at the time. Now, this indictment was initially filed under seal, meaning it was sort of secret, but in 2019, it was unsealed, became public. It was still unfortunate though, because I didn't have that company name. But luckily, he was also sanctioned by OFAC, or the US Department of Treasury. And in sanctioning him, they sanctioned all known affiliates of his, one being this company. And in order to sanction it, they have to list the name. And voila, I have it, Net Payguard Samabot Company. This is his company that he's registered. And you're probably wondering, why do I care about this company? Well, typically, incorporation records are sort of a gold mine of info. You have basically dates, you have addresses, you have corporate board appointments, sometimes you even have capital, right? How much money the company has. So I wanted to, look this company name up and maybe get a little bit more details that could help in my investigation. So I popped that sort of name into Iran's corporate registration records, and boom, it actually is sort of a gold mine of info. I see it's been registered. I see there's 3 other corporate board appointments on there, and I'll touch on them in the next slide. But I see Mr. Mesri is listed. He's listed as the CEO. This is all aligning with the indictment and everything like that. But one thing that catches my eye is his national ID number is listed. Now, throughout my entire course of investigation, I had never seen his national ID number. And this guy's been indicted 2 times over the last 5 years. You would expect that a national ID number might be present, say, on his most wanted poster, by OFAC sanction list, but it's been absent. It's not there. Last time I checked, maybe last week, it's still missing. And so this has been missing from both the FBI and OFAC. And so I found it. And this is actually pretty important. For those of you that do, say, KYC checks or politically exposed person checks, you'll often use this national ID number as a secondary sort of validation factor, right? Especially if you're dealing with Middle East names, it's very common to have the name Muhammad. So you try to validate which Muhammad is this Muhammad. Well, you use that secondary factor, in this case, the national ID number. So it's something that's quite useful and important, and something that's sort of been missing from, say, Mr. Mesri's most wanted poster. Now, I mentioned those 3 other corporate board appointments. I've redacted their names because, to the best of my ability and knowledge, they're not indicted. But it sort of begged the question, right? Who runs in the circle with someone who has been indicted not once, but twice? So basically what I did was mapped out their corporate board appointments, their affiliations. And I was able to find some interesting things. In particular, they had other companies under their names or they're affiliated with that were also sort of in the information technology sector. So sort of begging and warranting the question, well, what are these up to? Now knowing that what we know about NetPegard Samivat and Mr. Mesri here being indicted and how he might have used this, what are these being used for? So that was quite interesting to find. This is sort of the icing on the cake and why I think this report is so neat. I originally set out to map Mr. Mesri to known activity we track, right? And so I'm reading his indictment, and all the tradecraft described, the attacks, how they unfolded, the techniques used, all really align to the T to this cyber campaign that took place in April and May 2014. The threat actor behind this campaign is commonly referred to as Charming Kitten. And it's very well known that this happened, and everything described aligns with this. Why I'm so eager and sort of frustrated is Mr. Mesri incorporated his company in December 2014. Now, this doesn't make sense, right? You wouldn't register a front company after the fact of doing something malicious. Usually you incorporate a front company and then go do bad stuff. But this was reversed. So this had me sort of on edge of, well, how does everything else match but not this? So at the time I read this, I very much trusted it, but I went out and verified, right? That's sort of the key thing in Intel: trust but verify. So I went back to my handy incorporation record, saw when it was incorporated, and that was 10/2/1393. And you'll immediately sort of, for some of you, maybe jump out and say 1393, that's a very weird date. Well, I knew going into this that Iran uses the Persian calendar, where most of us in the West use the Gregorian calendar. So I knew there actually had to be a conversion factor. So that's also why I wanted to go verify this. Now, whoever at DOJ did the conversion factor for the indictment assumed this correctly. And when they did the conversion, they got December 23rd, 2014. The problem here where this went awry is who did the conversion assumed the US date format of month, day, year. It's very common for the US to use that format. Where pretty much everywhere else in the world, and including Iran, you use the day, month, year format. So that's quite the difference, right? That's the difference between October 2nd and February 10th, right? Huge gap. So if you make this sort of course correction, knowing now that it should be day first instead of month, you find that NetPegard Samivat was actually registered in April 2014. And this directly aligns with what I had previously pegged as sort of this campaign. So, at the end of this, I get to assess, Behzad Mesri is likely a part of this Charming Kitten group at the time of April and May 2014, conducting sort of this espionage activity. So what I did here, I just cross-referenced information in the beginning, right? I had that indictment. It said he had a company, but the company wasn't listed. I just cross-referenced with the sanctions announcement, which had it. And in the long run, what some of the stuff was listed, I trusted it, but I went out and double-checked it. I verified it. Us as analysts, as just human beings, we have biasness, right? That was sort of discussed earlier in some of the presentations. We all make mistakes. We have biasness. In this case, it was the wrong sort of date format. And what sort of the linchpin here, the key thing was those incorporation records. They really are a gold mine. They allowed me to actually verify this information, allowed me to actually sort of complete my analysis, and really are sort of the golden sort of piece of information if you want to go after this sort of stuff. The third case study I have for you guys, I've titled this Hiding in Plain Sight. This begins on a Saturday, sort of morning, afternoon, I don't remember, but I was just reading the news and came across this news article from the Daily Beast titled Iranian Hacking Group Targets Satellite Industry. And this came out October 2019. I'm reading along. I think this is interesting. And immediately it says, well, according to a sealed US indictment, an anonymous source familiar with the matter. And I take this immediately with a grain of salt. I'm like, okay, well, this is nice, anonymous, but it'd be nicer if I had some credibility here at the beginning. But I press on. I keep reading. I see that the alleged hackers, threat actors are MRS Co, an Iran dark coders team. Think, okay, it's interesting. Never heard of them, but okay. Targets the satellite industry around 2016, 2017. Okay. And the alleged victim is Digital Globe. So I immediately think, it's actually quite a lot of information here. Maybe I can actually validate this anonymous source based on this information. So I set out to do that, set out to see what else I can find. So I sit down, sort of put myself in the adversary's shoes. I think, okay, Digital Globe is the alleged victim. How would the attacker attack them? Well, they would probably register a lookalike domain. Digitalglobe.com is legitimate, it's real. They might register something that's quite different, but similar at the same time. So what I do is just manually do different permutations of the domain Digital Globe. So I immediately start with swapping out the lowercase I with the lowercase l. Don't find anything. So I thought, maybe they use a different domain, top level domain, right? Instead of .com, they use like .org or .tk, a free domain. No, still didn't find anything. So I finally get around to switching the G in globe with a Q, so digitalglobe.com. And boom, I have a winner here. I see that it's registered and active 2016 to 2017. This is the time frame the Daily Beast described the activity. So that's cool. And I wanted to sort of push this along, right? And so I look up who registered it. And not only what they registered, Digital Globe, but also the other domains they might have registered throughout the years. And I see some really interesting ones. I see they've registered also SaudiHajj.com, Aramco with 2A's.com, K2 Intelligence, again, switching that G and Q out, right? These are highly interesting to me because these are very much in line with Iran-based threat actors. Their typical targeting, their strategic interests, this all sort of tracks. So this is, I think I'm onto something here. What I do next is basically, again, pop digitalglobe.com into a search engine. And the first thing that appears is this threat intel report describing Charming Kitten, right? The group I mentioned in the last case. But what catches my eye is in the title, HBO hacker connection. I thought, aha, this sounds familiar. I thought, how is Mr. Mesri connected here? So again, doing some simple searches, this time of MRS Co, I come up with a nice sort of web shell. If you're not familiar with what a web shell is, it's basically a piece of computer code and used in hacking. And MRS Co basically says, hey, I wrote this code and I want to give a shout out to my friends. And one of his friends he lists is Scott Vashat. Now, this is the known alias on the most wanted poster of Mr. Mesri. So I thought that's really interesting. And going back to the original thing we set out to do was validate that anonymous source. Well, this gives that anonymous source a lot more credibility, right? We know Mr. Mesri is up to no good. He's been indicted twice. He's running in this circle with MRS Co. We can say that's a little bit more valid now. We've also sort of furthered that initial reporting, right, from the Daily Beast to actually maybe include this and give some context, give some background. And so I did this a couple months basically after the holidays. So this came out in, say, October 2019. My report came out in February. Then in September of 2020, the actual indictment gets released. So about between 9 and 12 months later, of the initial reporting in my report, we get the indictment unsealed, and it confirms more or less everything we've covered. MRS code is a part of it. It gives a little bit more details about the attacks, how they unfolded, everything used. And it's quite interesting to basically say, from a simple news article to a final intelligence product, months before sort of the mainstream sort of circles would have had this information. So this is really simple in terms of just reading the news, right? I was just coming along an article, thought it was interesting, use really simple searches to further the investigation along. I've mentioned Google a bunch of times, but as other people have mentioned throughout their talks, try those other search engines, Bing, Yandex, they all give different results and all can help further the investigation along. But in the end, we were able to validate that anonymous source, expand on the initial reporting, and finally produce our own intelligence report before sort of anyone else had access to that. So in closing here, what I hope you guys walk away from this talk, seeing, understanding, is I prefaced with not gonna actually cover a lot of technical stuff, right? There's no fancy technical tools I showed you. There was no real technical capabilities leveraged with regard to the OSINT. The tracking the cyber threat actors in these cases were much more about the mindset. And that brings me to point 2 here. OSINT is more of a mindset than anything. We see that in case 1, using the obstacle as inspiration. Use that as, how can I create a new technique? How can I think outside the box? In case study 2, leaving no stone unturned. Trust but verify. We're humans, we make mistakes. Go double check your work, double check everyone's work. And lastly, information hiding in plain sight. I say hiding, there's literally information just out there waiting to be plucked, have some context and analysts applied to. One last thing, which I hope you guys realize, but there's a little cyber threat intelligence analyst in all of us, whether we realize it or not. We see that with, say, the journalist and their story, they were tracking cyber threat actors. We see that with Mr. Mesri's identification number. If you're doing KYC checks, you're quite familiar with those ID numbers. You're quite familiar with finding those and using them. In this case, it was the context might have been different, but you could very much apply that same sort of skill set from a different investigative profession to cyber threat intelligence or vice versa. One last thing, I've left sort of more or less the sources, tools, etc. here for each case study. So if you actually want to go out yourself, do your own intelligence reporting on each case study, create your own sort of investigation, you're more than happy to. This is more or less all the starting points you need to reproduce what I've done, maybe even expand on it. And I hope you guys enjoyed the talk. I hope it was useful. And thanks for having me.
Great stuff, Curtis. Thank you very much. Definitely appreciate how you tied OSINT into this research. I do a lot of the same kind of things at my day job at Recorded Future. So I could geek out with you and get into the threat intel stuff, but let's focus on the OSINT aspects here. One question we had is on the Mr. Mesri. You had that national ID number, and we had a question as to how did you validate and confirm that that was a valid ID number? Is that something you were able to do?
So that's a really good question. So typically the ID number is found on the document for his company. So immediately we know that there's some validity to it because in order to actually get registered and basically inject capital into the company, there has to be some sort of validity to that number, just as if you were setting up your own company to get sort of funding and stuff like that. It's not necessarily, it's maybe his only ID number. Of course, you can have multiple ID numbers, especially say like Russian nationals have say 2 passport numbers. Iranians sometimes have multiple sort of national ID numbers, if you will. They're called some different things like that. But based on the circumstances of his corporate board appointment, the documents, everything like that, it was very highly likely that that was his actual ID number that was assigned to him at some time. Perhaps maybe it's changed over time. That's something that, maybe we can't corroborate at this time, but maybe further along our investigation if we were to sort of press further.
Right. And of course, government documents generally pretty reliable, but you never know. People can report incorrect information to the government for all kinds of
Yeah.
reasons.
No, of course. And I think, at least in any sort of intelligence profession, whether it's OSINT, cyber threat intel, it's using that sort of estimative language, right? Like we have to say assess with sort of some confidence level that this is the best of our knowledge, the best of our research, analytic techniques. This is, true up into some extent. So there's always that wiggle room of, yeah, maybe it's not, maybe it is sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's analysis. So you're going with best effort based on what evidence you have to hand.
Exactly.
One other question let me throw at you. So you work a lot with that sort of Middle East, Africa, Near East region. Are there some OSINT tools that are sort of particular to that area that you find yourself using?
That's a really good question. Typically, so for me, not necessarily. I think so. In the case of, say, like the incorporation records, obviously those are country specific, right? If you sort of broaden that out, it's still very much classic sort of OSINT techniques you would apply anywhere in the world. And then if you want to sort of hone in, say, on social media, you'll notice, say, like a lot of Iranian individuals use Instagram, for example. They like to use Telegram. So I think this goes back to Matthias's presentation of sort of knowing that culture and knowing sort of the apps, the flavor of the month, right? What they're using and stuff like that. So a little bit of cultural insight really sort of helps maybe the tools and where you should be looking. So for me, at least looking at Iran, it's looking at, say, Instagram, it's looking at, say, Telegram. A past sort of defunct social media they used to use is like Klub. You can still look up, say, cached pages and stuff, but it's not active anymore. So those are some, say, region or, say, country specific tools. The more general, say, technical tools we all use, I think are all sort of applicable, right? Like using VirusTotal, Shodan, all that stuff. They're global, right? It doesn't matter where you're looking at.
Yeah, it's the same process, but you might need to fine tune it or tweak it for a particular subject area for sure.
Exactly, yeah.
All right, cool.